Welcome back to Data Skeptic Animal Intelligence. I'm joined today for the intro by co-host Becky Hansis O'Neill. Welcome back, Becky.
It's great to be back. Thank you for having me.
So you've been helping out quite a bit, finding good guests this season. And our guest today is a little bit closer to you than some of the others. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, I'm a PhD student at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and the guest today, I'm really proud to say, is my advisor, Associate Professor Dr. Aimee Dunlap.
Really enjoyed this conversation. What gave you a sense that she'd be an ideal fit for the show this season?
So she teaches a couple classes, animal behavior, evolution of cognition, behavioral ecology, and they all touch on things that you and I have been chatting about behind the scenes. So I thought she'd be a really great general person to talk to because she has this just vast knowledge. She can answer most questions or has something to say. And her research is super appropriate as well. You both talked a lot about her work with Drosophila, so fruit flies, and doing evolution experiments in the lab, and I thought that was really appropriate and people would really enjoy it.
So fruit flies has been coming up a lot more than I expected in preparation for the season. What is the deal with the fruit flies?
So fruit flies are amazing because they're so well studied as a model organism just for physiology, but also behavior, cognition, evolution, all these things. So we have a ton of genomic information for them, genome mapped, all that great stuff. But we also have really great nervous system information in terms of like mapped nervous systems and years and years and years of behavioral data as well. So they're just one of the most researched model organisms you can have. So they make a really, really good organism to study things like evolution because you have all that knowledge base behind you.
What are their generations like?
I haven't bred them in the lab, but my guess is a few weeks. That's a guess, but
Sure.
yeah, pretty fast.
Yes, I mean, still long term maybe for graduate work, but you could practically observe evolution in the lab, I think, right? Which is kind of interesting.
I think so. It depends on how heavy selection is in your experiment and that kind of thing, but potentially, yeah.
And none of us seem to feel bad about experimenting on the fruit flies either.
Yeah, and that's an interesting question because there's pretty good research on neurotransmitters and how they change. Like when male flies are rejected by females, they have really elaborate mating and courtship behaviors. That things change in ways you might expect with an animal that can feel some things. So even though we don't feel bad about it, they share a lot of the same underlying molecular mechanisms with us that we associate with feeling things.
I wish you hadn't told me that.
Oh, sorry. There's plenty of people that are in the camp like, oh my gosh, don't go there. We need Drosophila as a model organism.
Yeah,
There's not
yeah.
enough evidence that they feel anything. But I don't know. I think their welfare is important too.
Yeah, proportionately, right? Maybe we should get into some ethics stuff at some point this season.
Totally.
And then are there any key, not takeaways, but prerequisites you think people should know before we jump right into the interview here?
So Amy's really interested in how animals use sensory information. So it's like going to be color, smell, touch, electromagnetism, all that kind of good stuff to make decisions. So you'll hear her kind of frame everything in this context. And one of the big ones is something called evolutionary preparedness. So most people have heard about this from psychology with regard to people. Most phobias are learned. We're not born with them, but some of them we learn much, much easier than others. And scientists think there might be an evolutionary component to this, that we're prepared to develop a phobia of, say, heights or maybe snakes, things like that. So animals can do this too. And it doesn't always have to do with phobias. If you think of like a foraging bee and they spent hundreds of thousands of generations foraging in a certain kind of habitat, and yellow flowers have the best pollen and nectar. If you have a little bit of a bias, you're more likely to be like, ooh, I like that yellow. That's saving you some time in your foraging decisions because that information has been consistent for multiple generations. So you get a little bit of a natural selection boost to help you make decisions quicker and more efficiently. So it doesn't mean they instinctually go to these yellow flowers. They just have this innate bias for yellow, for example.
Yeah, it's fascinating. You think if they had language, they just pass it down, but they learned it evolutionarily, I guess.
Exactly.
Cool. Well, let's jump right into that interview.
I am Aimee Dunlap. I'm an associate professor at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and I'm the interim director of the Whitney R. World Ecology Center.
And can you expand a little bit on your role there?
I have a regular faculty appointment of research and teaching and service, and I teach courses in animal behavior, behavioral ecology, and the evolution of cognition. We've got a lab with some grad students and a ton of undergrads working on a series of questions ranging from just pure lab-based cognition and neuroscience and then out into the field looking at ecology. We're interested in questions about how animals use information in the wild, and so bridging all of that's really good. And then the Whitney R. Harris World Ecology Center has been at the University of Missouri St. Louis for about 30 years, and that is dedicated to training graduate students to contend with our biodiversity crisis. And so we train students from all over the world, and it's a really cool program.
You'd mentioned focusing on how animals use information. With my background in like computer science, I have a bias. When I hear information, I think Shannon's entropy and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Does the Venn diagram overlap here? Do you use the word in similar ways?
Yeah, it does overlap a bit. Information is such an interesting concept
Yeah.
because it is used across fields. And I think, this idea of reducing uncertainty in the world, I think tends to be shared across those fields. In the case of animals, thinking about how they use information, it's putting us in the realm of, perception, learning, decision making, those aspects of cognition that animals need to handle, acquire, handle, and apply that information.
Are there standard modeling approaches to the decision making process?
No. So, people work on decision making, across psychology, neuroscience, evolutionary biology. And so, the extent to which people are putting mechanisms of what they think is going on in the brain. The extent that mechanisms are involved kind of depends on the field. I was trained in decision making from an optimality point of view. So really classic work in, from foraging theory of, foraging theory started with the idea that animals had perfect information, early on. And of course now, we know that that's not the case. That was a simplifying assumption. But, in behavioral ecology, we've been kind of contending with that since then, and how are animals solving the problem of incomplete information?
And what particular species are you interested in that research?
Yeah, I started out working with birds, and I worked with blue jays and tested some models. With blue jays, I did some work in the field with pinyon jays. These days, it's all arthropods, and that is because they're more tractable. If we want to know how they're using information over a lifespan, 20 years on a bird, 15 years on a bird is tough. If we're looking at insects that live for a season, that's an awful lot easier. The other piece is how the tractability of manipulating the environment. That's an awful lot easier in an insect than it is in a bird. Yeah, so we're working on Drosophila melanogaster. Do a lot of work on native bees, so bumblebees, different types of sweat bees. We've done work on orchid bees. We're doing some work on spring bees right now, andronids. There's a student working on hoverflies, which is a fly that has some adult life history similar to some bees. And then one student's working on tarantulas. So,
Well, one theme I've picked up in looking at some of your work is the connection between an environment and learning that I previously would have necessarily guessed was there. Could you expand on that?
yeah, so this is the idea of, learning allows animals and us to predict the future in a way. And when learning is working its best, we are picking up on patterns of the environment that are most likely to be, what's going to happen in the future. So that the learning that we are doing will help us make a better decision that's going to increase our fitness in whatever way we're looking at. And so the role of the environment is super important when we think about when animals should learn and when they shouldn't learn, and when learning should evolve.
Well, why wouldn't I learn all the time? Is there a cost to learning?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I always have a slide of the Muppets, the pigs in space. I don't know if you remember pigs in space, but why my dog is smart. Why is he not building a rocket, launching into the moon? It's because learning does have costs, and there's some really nice work on this. There are they kind of fall into some big categories. There are developmental costs. You can't be developing your brain, and your gonads at the same time, and those trade-offs have been demonstrated, or your brain and gut tissue at the same time. There are just metabolic costs. So we think that with memory, there's a lot of parallel processing probably going on. And so just maintaining and holding on to information does cost. That's really been demonstrated by some nice studies that have showed that, when animals are sick or they have metabolic demands, they don't put as much into cognition, which is super fascinating. The other costs are the ones I'm most interested in, and those are economic costs. Things like opportunity costs. If you're born knowing what to do, you don't have to waste all of this time trial and error learning. You're just going to start getting the food you need to get. If you're having to learn, you're paying costs of being really terrible for a while, right? Or costs of being naive. And while you're learning, if you already knew what to do, you could just be doing that. And so those are very interesting costs to me that people don't test as much as they've been able to do in those other areas for costs.
So some learning, I guess, must be hereditary in some sense, or maybe that's evolutionary, while others are me applying my brain and learning the environment. I guess, yeah, those are two categories. I don't know what my question is. Are those viable categories? Do you look at it the same way?
There's kind of two pieces to that. One is that, what is evolving and what is being inherited is a propensity to learn.
Hmm.
How quickly you're learning, what stimuli you're learning about more quickly than others, or what stimuli you're attending to and then learning about. That is one piece of it. The other piece is that there is information that can be inherited, right? And that information could be things like an inherited bias for a certain color, say for a bee. And that inherited bias is, also evolving. And so that inherited bias and then that ability to learn are interacting in the lifetime of an animal. And so in a lot of theories of learning, we're kind of putting learning opposed to something that is an inherited fixed response, like a bias or a preference, or just knowing what to do.
Well, when you say the environment, that it's an elegant phrase, but it also is kind of a wild card. There are so many factors at play. How do you do experimental design, or maybe like what's important in the environment?
To typify, the environment, we're talking about so many things, including the social environment of the animal, the developmental environment of the animal. And so that makes things very difficult. I think that's one reason why when people have studied, when people look at the, evolution of learning and they want to look at wild animals, they're looking at very specific behaviors where we can do that. So, I started working on bumblebees because of this exact thing. In the lab, we can manipulate the floral environment. We can manipulate the colors that they're seeing, the types of flowers that they're seeing, the number of types of flowers that they're seeing. We can manipulate, the contingency of whatever reward we're giving with those aspects of the flowers. And in that way, we can add a few levels of variability in the environment in a really simple case.
So, can you study evolution, or is that too long of a time scale to work it with?
The evolution question's a tough one, and I always like to refer to it as a time machine problem, right? We can't
Uh huh.
jump in a time machine and go back and see what actually happens. There are some long-term studies of populations that are possible. What we do in the lab is we use experimental evolution as an approach. And with that, we use fruit flies, Drosophila melanogaster, because they don't live a tremendously long time. And we can put a whole population in the size of a shoebox. And in that population, we can manipulate aspects of environmental change throughout 200 generations.
And how do those animals then know what's important?
Any animal we have in the lab, they come with evolution,
Sure.
already. But we can do something simple, So, for instance, the simplest experimental evolution study we did, we're just trying to evolve aspects of preference.
Mm-hmm.
And the simplest case, we could just give them a choice between two colors, and one of those choices will always rear those eggs. It'll have high fitness. The other choice we could throw in the trash. And if we do that over and over and over again through many generations, we would predict that we should see over time an increasing preference for females to lay eggs on one of those substrates and not the other one. It often doesn't work that simply, but in its simplest case, you can do something like that.
Is it fair to say you're actually evolving those organisms in the lab?
Yeah, we are. Absolutely. Yeah. We've done about 6 of these experiments so far. They're very time consuming. Like flies are small, they don't live very long, but there are 2, 3, 4 year experiments. Of every 2 weeks, we are running these selections. And what's really neat about this is it's different from artificial selection. So in artificial selection, we would individually measure each fly and we would say, The 10% top learners, we're going to let them breed. They're going to go on to the next generation. We're looking for a very specific task. In experimental evolution, the solution, how they get to it, is a little bit open. So in that, really specific case of, say, a color preference, they could evolve some kind of weighting factor in the brain, but they could also evolve a change in the visual system. What we found in our experiment when we tried to evolve a simple case like that is our flies evolved super high fecundity. They did not evolve making a better choice based on any kind of preference. They just laid more eggs, and they laid more eggs everywhere.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so experimental evolution means, I think it's cool because evolution, we can see across evolution that there are many ways to crack a certain problem,
Yeah.
and that's what we see in the lab too.
What does data collection look like in the lab? When an experiment's done, what have you produced?
Yeah. In an experiment like that, we have a mind-numbingly large number of scans of petri dishes that have eggs on them.
Mm-hmm.
And then those petri dishes need to be counted. The old school way, if you have a million undergrads, is just be like, oh, hey, take an iPad, and mark each of these with a pencil.
Sure.
Yeah, there are some machine learning algorithms that people have published that work really well for like little vials, but not for our large plates. And they also don't work so well when the eggs get all clumped together. I'll definitely do a deep dive and see if anything better is out there before we do the next experiment. But we often find that some of the results are subtle enough that we have to have a really good idea of how many eggs are there. We're usually counting and processing those as we go with an experiment, but the end of one of those experiments is so many small tests, subsets of every population tested 12, 15 different ways. So we end up with a whole lot of image files. For our bee experiments, we end up with a whole lot of video.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nicer ways to track bees on video.
And then, so I guess your raw data is an image file, and maybe there's some ML that can help you or something along the way. But like, there's seems like a few steps before you can say, "Oh, this is X behavior" or something going on like that. Could you describe that possibly labor-intensive process?
There are other tests that have to be done. If we want to know that learning is involved, we want to see that what they're doing has other properties of learning. So we want to see forgetting or forgetting curve. We would also test to see something that's called extinction, and that's from psychology. And that's this idea that you have an animal trained to do something, and now you have them do it, but you're not giving them a reward. How long do they persist in that behavior without a reward? And so you'll see a decline in that behavior. But if you give them a reward, that full learning is going to bounce back in like one or two trials.
Mm.
And we look for those dynamics in what the animals are doing before we can say for sure that learning has some component here.
I mean, it makes sense that it would decline with time if,
Mm-hmm.
there's a tree I shake to get fruit and it stops dropping fruit after a while, I stop shaking it.
Right.
Is it a predictable model, or what does the data look like when you experiment with that?
Oh, with extinction. Yeah. So there's decades of animal learning psychology that have tested some of these things, very well. We know that there are some things in the natural world for animals that can make learning, it will make it more extinction proof. One thing is a lot of repetitions of that learning, or when they are learning, sometimes they're not getting their reward. So an intermittent reward during that learning phase, they're going to stick with that behavior for longer. The other thing that we predict should make things tougher to extinguish goes back to evolution. And that's the evolution of a special kind of learning known as biologically prepared learning. And so that's this idea that all learning is not equal. And so if an animal and her grandmother and her great-grandmother and her great-great-grandmother and her great-great-great-grandmother have all had learning for a certain pair of stimuli be very effective over many generations, that should be more difficult to extinguish than a pairing that has a neutral evolutionary history.
Well, as you look across different species, there must be some variance. They're not automatons. It's not like you give them 4 trials, they learn the stimuli, and they forget it after X. Do you have a sense of that variation from experiment to experiment, or is it just kind of random, maybe?
It's kind of tough. We can make like predictions from natural history about certain kinds of learning. We can take closely related species that have different ecology. We could say, well, this species has to learn more about this aspect of food than this, and then we can test their learning. And there are lots of really nice comparative studies like that across many different animals. And people have tested things like the harshness of the environment. Learning should be more valued in a harsh environment. So people have looked at elevational gradients and latitudinal gradients or cross species gradients. I did some of this in my master's work when I was working on birds in the Arizona mountains. You can do these types of things, but they're not always perfect comparisons because each of those species will, and populations within the species will have a different evolutionary history. And they may be differently motivated to the task that you're giving them. And so a single test can't really tell you that, oh, the species A is smarter than species B. Like you actually have to give them a suite of tests. And if you see a consistent difference across tests, then we can say with a little bit more confidence. It's sort of like you just can't give the same test, to every. If you gave a test in English to somebody that doesn't speak English, they're not going to do well, but that doesn't mean that they can't do the task, right? It's a very similar thing for animals.
When you think about evolutionary history, what are the opportunities to study it? There's no counterfactual, there's no time machine, but we're not completely blind, I presume.
So what we can do is we can do experimental evolution. Now we can't do that in every animal, like a experimental evolution study in elephants or something. It's just not going to be possible.
Sure.
We have longer term experiments on animals with shorter lifespans. So for instance, people have done really nice comparisons of animals that have become introduced into a new area. What makes an animal able to be invasive successfully and another one not? And there could be a cognitive component there. Those are kind of natural experiments that you can do. The other thing that you can do is you can collect those data about patterns of change in the environment. How variable is the stimulus for a certain kind of food? Or how often, for a bee, how often is a certain type of flower blooming reliably at a certain time? You can take data from that, and using that, you can test comparative cognition across populations. That's something that is possible. The last thing you can do is use digital evolution, which I think is very cool, but there aren't that many people doing it.
Could you expand on what that even means?
Yeah, so this is evolving. You basically have organisms that are digital, and perhaps the energy that they need and that they are using is, say, space or time on a CPU, and you can define fitness in a certain way. And what you can do is you can set up different environments. You can set up your scenario. You can start them out with whatever you want to start them out with, and then you can evolve them digitally. Right? They're self-reproducing digital organisms. Yeah, and people have done a couple studies of that, evolving, simple forms of associative learning, which is super cool. And I would love to see people expanding that to things like biologically prepared learning.
I'm very interested in this area, and I think it's an area of academia that could advance and go in lots of directions. Is it going to go in its own direction, or is it going to overlap with biological learning?
Yeah, that's a really good question because, the whole field of like learning in computers and computer learning, there's not a lot of overlap with biological learning. The digital evolution people, there's more of an overlap. And there's a couple of labs at Michigan State that have been working on that. But I don't think they're doing anything. They're not answering questions about cognition right now, I don't think.
I guess part of what I'm wondering is to frame it in a cynical way, I could say they're inventing a new video game and they're training agents to play in this completely artificial world.
It has, a lot of parallels to a theory. When you're developing new theory, you are carefully choosing your assumptions. You are carefully choosing what to include and what you're leaving out. I think when a lot of people start in students, I'm trying to teach them how to do different types of modeling and theory. They want to throw the kitchen sink in. They want to throw everything in
Sure.
there, right? But in losing the elegance of that model, you lose some of the ability to understand what's going on there. So I think with digital evolution questions, it's a very similar problem set that anybody would have in thinking about setting up, just about any kind of modeling or simulation that you're going to do. Like a lot of choices have to be made on the front end, which are going to affect your results, right?
Are there any specific evolutionary pressures that people know about that could pressure more learning or create an environment for learning to take place?
There are so many models and so many more like really beautiful ones come out every year. The big consensus is that we're talking about environmental change. And so work that I've done with Dave Stevens, we've taken the choice of, instead of just saying change is change, we have different flavors of change. And so we have what we call environmental certainty. And you can think of that as like the long-term average that something is true, like across many generations. And we have what we call reliability, which is the same way many other people use reliability, which is the probability that if something is present, something else will be true. Like the reward will be contingent on that. And you can do many extensions of those types of models, but basically what it tells us is that as long as the reliability of what you're learning is greater than the long-term average, we should have learning happen. Otherwise, we're looking at, an evolved bias or a fixed response. I mean, that's our model. So obviously, it's my favorite
Sure.
model that's out there. But I like it because it's very tractable. You can
Yeah.
measure certainty, you can measure reliability, you can manipulate both of those, you can make those things happen. The more complicated the model, the tougher it is to start manipulating things in an experiment.
What would it mean for it to be falsifiable?
We have found a few things, with our experimental evolution. What we're looking for is we can have our predictions, we can say what should be favored for any point, any combination of reliability and certainty, and then we can evolve populations and see what happens. And the manuscript we're finishing up right now, we predict a lot of area in which learning should evolve. But what we have found is that the world needs to be more reliable than what our model says in order for learning to enhance learning to evolve. So that
Sure.
reliability needs to be, much closer to 100%. It has to be between 3/4 and 100%. 3/4 reliable, 75% reliable is not reliable enough to evolve enhanced learning. So that's a case where, it doesn't make us reject the whole model, but it does cause us to know that, it's not just reliability that's going to promote the evolution of learning. There are costs, there are other things that we're not accounting for in our model. And then now we need to go see what that is.
Well, I know there's no standard unit of measuring intelligence, but somehow I know like a dolphin's more intelligent than an ant, I guess, or maybe that's my bias, but
Well, I mean, you have to think about what they're doing with their brain size. And
yeah.
so that's been, I think, a big revolution in the past 20 years is more of an appreciation for what animals like bees and ants are able to do. And it's an intriguing test case for a lot of people because they are doing quite sophisticated things with much smaller brains. It could mean a couple of things. It could mean that, oh wow, they're super smart. They're maybe more efficient somehow. You could do some neural network modeling and see what's going on there. Or some of the stuff that we thought was very complex cognitively is maybe not as complex as we thought it was.
Sure.
And so that's definitely something that's going on right now. And there's some really great work in bumblebees showing that they have cultural transmission. They have very sophisticated forms of social learning. We've done some work in the lab about how they respond to varying rates of change and how that affects their social learning. And they're very plastic and flexible little animals.
What are some of the open, interesting research questions you're pursuing?
Right now, I'm really on this question of the evolution of prepared learning. It was first proposed in the early 70s. Then it got tested in the 80s and applied to some human stuff and applied to some primate stuff in the terms of like the evolution of phobias, and how quickly phobias are learned. And it just kind of dropped after that. And we did an experimental evolution study where we evolved prepared learning. So we evolved flies that would learn about color more quickly than odor based on manipulating reliability. And we also evolved flies that learn more about odor than color. That kind of kicked off a little bit of work on preparedness, but I kind of feel like it's sort of it could be like a grand unifying theory of ecologically relevant learning, because we have nice work on when animals should learn and when they shouldn't. And we know that animals learn about some things better than others. And that's what preparedness and preparedness theory can explain for us. But I think it's really handy to apply to cases like pollination. That's what I'm really thinking about right now. Lots of great work. There's all of these different flowers, and flowers are co-evolving with their pollinators. And these pollinators have differing amounts of cognition, and they have differing amounts of like innate biases and what they're learning about more quickly than others. And if we can put nice, conceptual theory over all of that, we can make predictions on what we should see when, right? We don't need to do the experimental evolution. We can look at all the natural history and all of the great data on what kind of nectar are in these flowers and how abundant are these flowers? Like environmental change and environmental reliability has been typified. So now across vertebrates and invertebrates, we can make predictions about preparedness and what should go along with that preparedness, like not extinguishing that learning and remembering things for longer. And when it interacts with other things, you're going to be paying attention to what was evolutionarily prepared. I think there's a lot of power in that framework to explain patterns in nature of why animals are learning about some things better than others.
When you evolve a species to prefer, let's say, odor over color, or it sounds like you can do it both ways, is that maybe could we look under a microscope and see they've evolved better sensory organs, or is it like the brain is preferring these signals more?
Yeah, we can do that. In that particular experiment, we didn't. But we have looked at flies that evolved a preference for like an orange substrate over a pineapple substrate. And what we've done with that is we've looked at gene expression. So we've looked at gene expression in their brains. We've looked at gene expression in their feet because flies have gustatory receptors in their feet. And what we have found is that there are different patterns of gene expression across those flies. And we can look at how they're expressing those genes if they're standing around on what we evolved them to like versus standing around on what we evolved them not to like. And it was kind of interesting because, I predicted we'll see differential expression of genes involved in the olfactory receptors that we know are involved in, say, citrus, versus something else. And we saw movement in a little of those, few of those, but we saw changes in their gustatory receptors. And so basically, one set of flies is kind of ignoring bitter more than another, which is very interesting. So we see changes there. And that's what we were predicting. But we saw changes we were not predicting. So, for instance, for flies that were evolving a preference for pineapple, we saw huge changes in everything involving with synapses. So, neurotransmitters, putting those neurotransmitters into vesicles, those vesicles docking at the end of the neuron, those vesicles going over. We were seeing an upregulation in handling a series of neurotransmitters. We didn't see that in the other. And then for the flies that evolved a preference for orange, we saw shifts in some of their genes involved in responding to parasitoids, which seems kind of random, but actually it's not. There's been some work on why do flies have a preference for orange, and it had been proposed that it's because orange has this epicarp on top, and it would be harder for a parasitoid wasp to stick their eggs through an orange peel to get to Drosophila eggs. This is the idea. So they kind of put a circumstantial case together and showed that the parasitoid wasps don't like orange and the flies do like the orange. And so our preliminary data kind of lend towards the hypothesis that they put out, which is that this evolutionary preference for orange, which actually predates our experiment, we just evolved even more of a preference for orange. It may be linked into response to parasitoids, which is a huge risk for Drosophila. So these are wasps that will lay eggs into the eggs of other insects, and it's not going to go well for that egg.
It all lines up and kind of makes sense when you tell it that way. But how do you worry, or how do you make sure you don't come up with like a just so story in these situations?
That's kind of a problem with the gene expression data. We do a lot of that. And you know that if you're going to do a gene expression study on any kind of behavior, you're going to get some differences.
Sure.
So we can go in with hypotheses on what we should see differences in, but you do find yourself trying to link things to things, where has this gene been invoked in the literature so far? And how does this connect to that? And so I think that is a problem that is not unique to us,
Sure, yeah.
but has been for ages in looking at some gene expression data, especially if you don't have super strong hypotheses going in. We did not have the parasitoid hypothesis going in. I thought, it might be neat, but, and we had no idea about the changes in the neurotransmitter differences. What that does make me wonder, though, is when we're evolving preference in a two-choice scenario, we could be evolving a preference, say, for pineapple. We could also be evolving a preference against orange.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those things will result in that choice.
Interesting, yeah.
And that takes follow-up experiments to kind of suss out what's going on there.
Well, we touched earlier on machine learning and neural networks having some different approaches, but maybe some standard language. Do you have any thoughts on inspiration that community could get from your research?
Well, I would just love if anyone would think a little bit more about where is this learning ecologically relevant? Learning didn't evolve, it evolved out in the world. It evolved with animals needing to solve problems. And so I think the closer we can get to making things a little bit more ecologically inspired or ecologically relevant would be super helpful. And just like with many fields that study similar questions, those batches of literature do not cite each other very much. I'll get into the computer science literature when people are citing my papers, and then that gets me into the a goose chase of what are they citing and what's going on here, and that's really cool, But I'm really busy and I need to focus on this other thing, So I think it would be helpful if there's more people thinking across these systems, and there are people thinking across.
Do you have advice for any aspiring young scientists looking to get into the field?
Yeah, I would just read the literature, find out what are the questions you think are the coolest and email people.
Yeah,
Um, the field, of cognitive ecology, the ecology and evolution of cognition it's getting bigger. I mean, it used to be tiny. It's getting bigger, but it's a very friendly field, and people are very collegial. Yeah, definitely email people with questions and keep an eye out. There's some really great fellowships that have popped up and people working on very cool systems and very cool places. I think there's a lot of possibilities for students to do new cool stuff.
good advice. Yeah. And where can listeners follow you specifically with your work and maybe stuff going on in the lab?
Yeah, so they can look at our lab website, which is cognitiononthewing.com. And then I'm on Blue Sky at Ms. Aimee Sue on Blue Sky. So we post some things there.
Sounds good. We'll have links in the show notes for listeners to follow up.
All
Aimee,
right.
thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Yeah, thanks for the awesome questions.